The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
Dr. Carson, before we turn the floor over to you, it is necessary that I place you under oath. Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Do you agree to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Senate?
I do.
You may sit down. Dr. Carson, your written statement will be made a part of the record in its entirety, and you may now make your oral statement as you choose. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
May I interrupt you before you get started? I should have said I encourage you to introduce your family. I think you were about to do that anyway, but
yes.
You are certainly welcome to please introduce your family who have come to be with you.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Senator Brown. Thanks to Senator Rubio for that kind introduction. Thank you for members of the committee, virtually all of whom I've met with, who've been very gracious, and I very much appreciate that. Thanks also to President-elect Trump for his friendship, leadership, and for his trust for such an important role. I would like to introduce my family. Directly behind me is my wife, Candy, of 41 years, my college sweetheart. And starting from this end, my oldest son, Murray, another Yaley, who is an engineer, and his wife, Larone, who is a youth pastor, and my daughter-in-law, Merlin, who is a physician and a businesswoman, and my granddaughter, Tesora, who is just a sweetie, and my middle son, Ben Jr., or BJ as we affectionately call him, a very successful entrepreneur businessman. And our good friend, Marcia Jackson, wife of former Secretary Alfonso Jackson. And I think you probably know the others here. But Royce is, oh, there he is. Okay. My youngest son, Royce, and his father-in-law, Alexander Chapo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we welcome you all to the committee today. Dr. Carson, you may proceed.
You know, as a youngster, I remember actually feeling that I was pretty lucky. We lived in a 750 square foot GI home in Southwest Detroit. It actually had a lawn and a little one-car garage, and we thought that was paradise. And then my parents got divorced, and you know, my mother discovered that my father was married to someone else, and she didn't have any skills, basically third grade education. We had no place to live. She couldn't afford the house, so we ended up moving to Boston, moving in with relatives. So I have actually, in my life, understood what housing insecurity was. And we were there in Boston for a couple of years. And I remember as a 9-year-old looking through a building across the street out of which all the windows had been broken, and a sunbeam was shining through it. And it made me think about my future. I remember thinking that I probably would never live to be 25, because that's what I saw around me. But my mother had very different ideals. You know, she worked extraordinarily hard as a domestic, leaving the house at 5 in the morning, getting back at midnight, day after day after day. And her strong desire was not to be dependent on anybody else. And people were always criticizing her, and they said, "You have 2 boys, you can be on 8 dependent children." And she said, "No, I can't." And she worked very hard. She would sometimes take us to the homes that she cleaned. And many of them were fabulous homes. And she would say, "Would you rather live in this wonderful place, or would you rather live where we live?" And she would say, "You know, the person who has the most to do with determining where you live is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. You know, that made a very strong impression on me. And she insisted later on, when we were able to return to Detroit, still not to our idyllic home. We still couldn't afford to live there, still in a multifamily, dilapidated place with rats and roaches. But nevertheless, she was independent. And we still had that dream of being able to get back there. But I was a terrible student, and she insisted that I read. She insisted that my brother read. We weren't very enthusiastic about that, but back in those days, you had to do what your parents told you. And as I started reading, I began to discover a whole new world. We were desperately poor, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to call me dummy. They were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, I had a very different impression of who I was at that point. And, you know, it's one of the reasons that Candy and I started the Carson Scholars Fund, a component of which are reading rooms. And we put in reading rooms all over the country. We have 165 of them now, primarily in Title I schools where kids come from homes with no books. They go to a school with no library or poorly funded library. They're not likely to become readers. As you know, 70 to 80% of high school dropouts are functionally illiterate. And if we can truncate that downstream, you can change the trajectory of their lives. And that's really what it's about, changing lives and providing opportunities for people. It makes all the difference in the world. You know, we had a program at Hopkins, and I would have 700 to 800 students at a time come in on a regular basis. If you came to Johns Hopkins, some of you probably have, and you saw all the school buses around. That was bringing in the kids and trying to encourage them in terms of what they could do. And I got involved in a lot of the programs in Baltimore with the East Baltimore Community Development, Inc., and with the community school, and with all the schools and the mayors. And, you know, that was a very important part of my life, even though I was an extraordinarily busy surgeon. And I do believe that government can play a very important role. I know some have distorted what I've said about government, but I believe government is important. And it is there, I believe, to promote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What has happened too often is that people who seemingly mean well have promoted things that do not encourage the development of innate talent in people. And hence we have generation after generation of people living in dependent situations. It's not that they're bad people. It's that this is what they've been given. This is all they know in many cases. I think we have an opportunity here to do something about that if we take a more holistic approach. When we talk about HUD traditionally, most people think putting houses over putting roofs over the heads of poor people. But it has the ability to be so much more than that, particularly if we take a holistic approach. And we think about how do we develop our fellow human beings. I see each individual as human capital that can be developed to become part of the engine that drives our nation, or if not developed, becomes part of the load. And we are the ones who are tasked with helping to make the difference. So I do believe that government is extraordinarily important. And one of the things that I want to do, instead of just listening to the sage people of Washington, D.C., and there are some wise people here, I want to go on a listening tour. I want to hear from the people with boots on the ground who are actually administering programs, who are benefiting from the programs. I want to see what actually works and what does not work. I want to analyze why it works and why it doesn't work. Before I go on the road to do that, I want to do that at HUD. We have people there who've been there for 10, 20, 30, even 40 years. And I don't think a lot of people listen to what they have to say. I suspect that they have garnered a tremendous amount of information. And I want to get that information from them. I want to work with them on a regular basis. Some people say, but medicine, why would you go into something like HUD? Well, I actually believe that there's a tremendous nexus, a great intersection, because good health has a lot to do with a good environment. And after working so hard on so many people and then putting them back into an environment with lead and with all kinds of inducements for asthma and other chronic diseases, that's not very, very helpful. And I'm looking forward to, the Safe and Healthy Homes program at HUD and enhancing that program very significantly. And why is all of this so important? Well, there was a Brookings study, very important study, which showed that if people did 3 things, their likelihood of living in poverty would be 2% or less. And that's really what we want to do, keep people from living in poverty. Those 3 things were graduate from high school, get a job, and wait until you're married to have children. Think about that. And, what that means is that there are points of intervention, things that we can do to make a difference in people's lives. Also, think about this fact. In terms of our human capital that's being wasted, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison inmates. That means there's something wrong. We have high recidivism rates. We have people who go into prison with little education and little in the way of skills, and they come out with little education and little in the way of skills. So what are they going to do? They go back to doing what they were doing before, hence we have these high recidivism rates. We need to think about how do we give them education? How do we give them skills? How do we cultivate the innate talent that is in those individuals so that they become part of the engine once again? And recognize we only have 330 million people. Now, it sounds like a lot of people, but that's a quarter of the people they have in India or China. We're going to have to compete with those nations into the future, which means we have to develop all of our talent. Now you say, well, that all sounds great and wonderful, but you were a pediatric neurosurgeon. How could you have anything wonderful to say about any of these things? Well, I have to chuckle when I hear people say things like that because there's an assumption that you can only do one thing and that we have these very limited brains and they're incapable of learning anything else. I find that kind of humorous, particularly knowing what the human brain is capable of. Billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. Any brain can do that. You can't overload it. You hear some people say you overload your brain. You can't do it. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to challenge the capacity of your brain. So we do have the ability to learn. More importantly, we have the ability to work together. And that is absolutely critical. We in America, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, we are not each other's enemies. We must come to that understanding. There are real people out there who really want to destroy us, but we don't need to be doing that ourselves. We need to be combining our collective intellect. And one of the things that I learned in my private life as a board member at Kellogg for 18 years and Costco for 16 years is how to select a good CEO. And I'll tell you, a good CEO doesn't necessarily know everything about the business. He's not a marketing specialist. He may not be a financial specialist. There are many things that he doesn't know, but he knows how to pick those people and how to use them. And that is one of the marks of good leadership. So in closing, I've been very fortunate to be able to move from the bottom rung of the socioeconomic level to the top rung and to understand how people feel in all those different levels. And I got to tell you, We're all in the same boat. And if part of the boat sinks, the rest of it is going down too. And it means what we need to do is exercise true compassion. True compassion is not keeping people in a situation where we can feel good about what we're doing. True compassion is putting them in a situation where they can feel good about where they're going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carson.